Paris, 1925. The Eiffel Tower stood tall over the city, but something wasn't quite right. The Iron Lady of France was rusting, and the cost of maintaining her was becoming astronomical. At least, that's what one man wanted you to believe. His name was Victor Lustig, and he was about to pull off one of the most audacious cons in history. This wasn't just any scam. This was bold, brilliant, and absolutely insane. He was going to sell the Eiffel Tower. Not once but twice. Lustig wasn't your typical criminal. Born in what is now the Czech Republic in 1890, he spoke 5 languages fluently and carried himself with the grace of European aristocracy. He had a scar on his face from a romantic dispute, which only added to his mysterious charm. But beneath that sophisticated exterior was the mind of a master manipulator, always calculating, always scheming. Before Paris, Lustig had already made a name for himself in criminal circles. He worked the transatlantic ocean liners that carried wealthy passengers between Europe and America, posing as a nobleman or successful businessman. He would befriend rich travelers during the week-long voyages, gain their trust, and separate them from their money through various elaborate schemes. The confined space of a ship was perfect for his work. People had time to talk, to form relationships, to trust. And by the time they realized they'd been conned, Lustig would be long gone, already aboard another ship with a new identity and new marks. So how do you sell one of the most famous landmarks in the world? You start with a brilliant observation. Lustig noticed that the Eiffel Tower, built as a temporary structure for the 1889 World's Fair, was indeed showing its age. Paint was peeling, rust was spreading, and the French newspapers were openly discussing the massive costs of upkeep. Some journalists even questioned whether the tower should be torn down. That's when Lustig saw his opportunity. He had the hotel where he was staying create fake government stationery. He then sent out official-looking letters to 6 of Paris's most prominent scrap metal dealers, inviting them to a confidential meeting at the prestigious Hôtel de Crillon. The letter was signed by the Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. That deputy director, of course, was Victor Lustig himself. The dealers arrived at the hotel, probably nervous, definitely curious. Lustig met them dressed impeccably in a suit, looking every bit the government bureaucrat. He led them to a private conference room and began his pitch. The French government, he explained with perfectly practiced reluctance, had made a difficult decision. The Eiffel Tower was simply too expensive to maintain. It would be demolished and sold for scrap. But here's the genius part. Lustig told them the government was deeply embarrassed about this decision. The tower had become a symbol of Paris, of France itself. They couldn't announce this publicly without causing a scandal. That's why this meeting was secret. That's why they were the only dealers being considered. 7,000 tons of high-quality iron, and it could be theirs. He even took them on a tour of the tower in a rented limousine, pointing out the rust and structural issues, building credibility with every word. The dealers were convinced. This was the opportunity of a lifetime. Lustig watched them carefully during the tour, studying their reactions, measuring their greed. He quickly identified his mark: André Poisson, a scrap metal dealer who was relatively new to Paris and desperate to break into the inner circles of business. Poisson was insecure about his status and eager to prove himself. In other words, he was perfect. Lustig pulled Poisson aside for a private meeting. This is where the con became truly masterful. Instead of pushing harder, Lustig seemed hesitant. He implied, with carefully chosen words and meaningful pauses, that as a government official, he wasn't paid very well. He suggested that perhaps a private arrangement could ensure that Poisson's bid would be accepted over the others. Poisson understood immediately. This was how business was done, wasn't it? A bribe. And the fact that this government official was corrupt actually made the whole thing seem more legitimate. After all, what kind of con man asks for a bribe? This psychological trick was pure genius. Lustig understood that people trust their own cynicism. Poisson thought he was being clever, that he was getting an inside deal through slightly shady but normal business practices. The bribe made Lustig seem more real, more human, more like every other government official who might be willing to bend the rules for personal gain. It never occurred to Poisson that the entire scenario was fabricated, that there was no demolition, no sale, no opportunity at all. Poisson paid up. He handed over a massive sum for both the rights to the tower's scrap metal and a substantial bribe to ensure his bid was accepted. Lustig took the money, shook his hand, and promised the paperwork would be delivered soon. Then Victor Lustig vanished. He left Paris immediately, leaving Poisson waiting for contracts that would never come. And here's the beautiful final twist. Poisson was so humiliated, so embarrassed that he'd been conned, that he never reported it to the police. He didn't want anyone to know he'd been fooled. Lustig had counted on that shame, that pride, and he was absolutely right. Think about the psychology of that for a moment. Lustig didn't just con Poisson out of money. He created a situation where Poisson would become his own jailer, trapped by his own embarrassment. The perfect crime isn't just one where you don't get caught. It's one where the victim won't even report it. Lustig understood human nature at a level most people never reach. He knew that pride and shame are more powerful than anger or the desire for justice. But the story doesn't end there. Most con artists would have celebrated and moved on. Not Lustig. 6 months later, after things had quieted down and no police had come looking for him, he returned to Paris and did it again. He found new scrap metal dealers, set up the same con, and sold the Eiffel Tower a second time. The audacity of this decision is staggering. He had gotten away with it perfectly. He could have retired on that money, or at least moved on to other schemes in other cities. But Lustig couldn't resist. Maybe it was greed, or maybe it was the thrill, the pure joy of pulling off the impossible. Whatever his motivation, he walked back into Paris and ran the exact same con with different victims. This time, though, his mark wasn't quite as embarrassed. The second victim did go to the police, and Lustig had to flee France quickly. He boarded a ship to America, leaving Europe behind but certainly not his criminal career. In the United States, Lustig continued his work with remarkable success. He moved from city to city, running elaborate cons, always staying one step ahead of the law. He once met Al Capone, the most dangerous gangster in America, and convinced him to invest $50,000 in a business deal. Lustig kept the money for 2 months, then returned it to Capone, claiming the deal had fallen through. Capone, impressed by Lustig's apparent honesty in returning the money, gave him a $5,000 reward for his trouble. That had been the plan all along. But Lustig's most ambitious American venture was counterfeiting. He didn't just print fake money. He created what many experts considered the most perfect counterfeit $100 bills ever made. The bills were so good that even bank tellers had trouble spotting them. Lustig called it his money-making machine, and sometimes sold the machine itself to marks, convincing them it could print real currency. Over his career, Lustig pulled off an estimated 45 major cons across 2 continents. He stole hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe millions in today's money. The remarkable thing is that he never used violence. He never threatened anyone. He simply talked to people, understood their desires and weaknesses, and gave them exactly what they wanted to believe. Lustig actually developed a set of rules for the perfect con, what he called the 10 Commandments for con men. Listen carefully rather than talking too much. Never look bored with the mark. Wait for the other person to reveal their political opinions, then agree with them. Never discuss illness unless the mark brings it up. Never pry into a person's personal circumstances. Always look prosperous but never ostentatiously wealthy. Never get drunk, because a drunk tongue reveals secrets. These weren't just rules for conning people. They were rules for human psychology, for making people trust you, for becoming whoever your mark needed you to be. These principles worked because they tapped into fundamental human desires. Everyone wants to be heard, to be understood, to feel important. Lustig made people feel all of those things. He was a mirror, reflecting back whatever his victims wanted to see in him. If they wanted a sophisticated government official, that's who he became. If they needed a struggling bureaucrat who could be bribed, he played that role perfectly. His genius was in reading people so accurately that he could transform himself into their ideal counterpart. But every run has to end eventually. In 1935, federal agents finally caught up with him, not for selling the Eiffel Tower, but for counterfeiting. The Secret Service had been tracking those perfect $100 bills, and they finally traced them back to Lustig. He was arrested, tried, and convicted. Even then, Lustig almost escaped. While awaiting trial, he actually managed to escape from the federal detention headquarters in New York using bedsheets tied together. He was recaptured 27 days later in Pittsburgh, which only added to his legend. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison and sent to Alcatraz, the infamous island prison in San Francisco Bay that housed America's most dangerous criminals. Victor Lustig, the man who never used violence, who relied only on charm and intelligence, ended up in the same prison as murderers and gangsters. He died there on March 11, 1947, of pneumonia. He was 57 years old. The man who had traveled the world in luxury, who had stayed in the finest hotels, who had convinced people to buy things that weren't for sale, died in a prison cell on a cold rock in the middle of the bay. But his legacy lived on. Victor Lustig proved something profound about human nature. He showed that confidence, real or manufactured, can overcome almost any obstacle. He demonstrated that people see what they want to see, believe what they want to believe. He understood that the best lies are the ones that confirm what the mark already suspects or hopes is true. The Eiffel Tower, of course, still stands in Paris. It was never sold for scrap. It was never in danger of being torn down. Today it's one of the most visited monuments in the world, welcoming millions of tourists every year. Those visitors probably don't know that twice in 1925, it technically belonged to scrap metal dealers who had paid enormous sums for 7,000 tons of iron they would never receive. Victor Lustig's story is a reminder that in the right hands, with the right confidence, anything can be sold. Even a national monument, even the impossible. All you need is the courage to try, the intelligence to plan, and the absolute certainty that you'll succeed. Lustig had all three in abundance. He was charming, he was brilliant, and he was completely shameless. He saw the world as a stage and everyone in it as a potential mark. He never felt guilty about his cons because he believed, in his own twisted logic, that his victims were driven by their own greed. They wanted something for nothing, an inside deal, a special opportunity. He simply gave them what they wanted. History remembers him as one of the greatest con artists who ever lived. Not because he stole the most money, though he stole plenty. Not because he was the most violent or dramatic, because he was neither. He's remembered because he had style, because he had audacity, because he looked at the Eiffel Tower and thought, I could sell that. And then he did, twice. In doing so, he created a legend that would outlive him by decades. His story has been told and retold, inspiring books, films, and countless other con artists who tried to match his brilliance. But none ever quite captured what made Lustig special. It wasn't just his intelligence or his charm. It was his absolute belief in himself, his unwavering conviction that he could pull off anything he set his mind to. That confidence was infectious. It made people believe in him even when they should have known better. And that, perhaps more than any technique or trick, was his greatest gift.